Welcome to another SOJC video tutorial on the Canon R7. There are some fundamental but important skills a photographer must master before they can move forward. This tutorial will cover exposure, getting the right amount of light onto the camera sensor or film. It's that simple. Exposure is figuring out how to get the proper amount of light to capture the image the way you want. Or it's that complicated. How do we control exposure? What is the right amount of light? What's a correct exposure? By adjusting our camera for a proper exposure, what else are we affecting in our photograph? How do the settings that affect exposure affect our photographs in other ways? And what tools does a camera offer to help us set a proper exposure? When we master this skill, we're on our way to taking control of our photographs. We move beyond simply point and shoot and hope. So let's begin. In the age of Photoshop, why does it even matter? If we can lighten and darken and adjust and manipulate an image in the computer, why worry? Because a camera sensor is not nearly as complex or flexible as the human eye. We can see a tremendous range of brightness and color. Sensors get better and better daily, or even hourly it seems, but they are still way, way behind our eye. When we look at a scene, our eye, with the help of our brain, sees a tremendous amount of information and is constantly adjusting. We can look up and see the subtleties of a puffy white cloud in a bright sky, and then look into the shadows under a tree and make out the details of each blade of grass. A camera can't. When we take a picture, we are often making a compromise, and that means either the camera is making that decision or we are. We are either pointing and shooting and hoping for the best, or we are setting an exposure to capture what we want the way we want it. If part of our photo is so bright that there is no detail, a very bright sky, for example, no amount of Photoshop can fix that. And if there are areas of the photo that are pure black, again, we can't fix that in the computer. If a photo is too bright, we call that overexposed or blown out, while the reverse, a too dark photo, would be underexposed. But as we'll explore in this video, under, over, and properly exposed is a little like Goldilocks. Maybe the porridge is too hot or too cold for her, but maybe you like your porridge hot or your bed soft. Proper depends. We have three ways of controlling the exposure. You'll sometimes hear it referred to as the exposure triangle. ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Those are our tools, our controls. By adjusting any one of them, we can lighten or darken our image. And if we want, we can compensate for changing one by changing one or both of the other two in the opposite direction. When we take a photograph, light hits the sensor of the camera. Add just the right amount of light and you get the exposure you want. It's like filling a glass with water. Too much water and it overflows. Your photo is overexposed. Too little water and your photo will be too dark. We will learn to adjust each of these settings, how, and just as importantly, why we might choose to change one, ISO for example, rather than shutter speed or aperture. ISO is the size of the glass. It's a measure of the sensitivity of the camera to light. If we raise the ISO, the camera becomes more sensitive to light, so we need less of it, a smaller glass that we can fill with less water, less light. ISO settings typically start at 100 or 200 and can go up and up and up. Each time you double the ISO, you are doubling the sensitivity to light. 200 is twice as sensitive as 100. ISO 6400 is 64 times more sensitive to light than the lowest setting of 100. The R7 has a top ISO of 25,600, but avoid those higher settings unless absolutely necessary. 6400 is probably the highest usable setting under most conditions. Shutter speed is how long we turn on the faucet. A camera has a shutter, think of it as a door or a curtain that covers the sensor, and it opens and closes to allow light in for a specific amount of time, usually measured in small fractions of a second. On the R7, the display shows a fraction for shutter speeds less than 1 second. Exposures longer than a second are possible, but you would almost certainly need a tripod for those kinds of photos. So as we raise the shutter speed from say 1/100th of a second to 1,000th, we are letting in less light. If nothing else changes, our photos will get darker and darker. Finally, aperture. Aperture measures how large the opening is for light. Do we turn on our faucet for a trickle or a full blast? Do we let the light in through a small opening or a large one? We measure the size of this opening in something called f-stops. Confusingly, the larger the f-stop number, the smaller the opening. So an f-stop of f11 lets in less light than f4. That's because f-stops, just like shutter speeds, are really fractions, but we never refer to them that way. So we write f4 or f5.6, and if you think of those as fractions, you may, more quickly, remember that larger f numbers mean less light. But I'll admit, this trips up a lot of students. Take your time, practice, and eventually it becomes second nature. Hopefully what is obvious is that if you use a faster shutter speed, which lets in less light, you'll need to compensate. So, how, you ask? There are two ways. So quick, hit pause, think it through, and I'll give you a second. Okay, so you've set a faster shutter speed, say from 1/250th of a second to 1/1000th of a second. You're letting in less light. How much less? 4 times less, right? 250 to 500 cuts the light in half. 500 to 1,000th of a second does it again. So, how do we compensate for that? You could raise your ISO, make the camera more sensitive to light so it needs less. If you go from ISO 200 to 800, you've doubled it twice, made your sensor 4 times more sensitive, canceling out the faster shutter speed's effect on light. Or you could use a larger aperture. You could go from f16 to f8. Okay, these numbers are not intuitive and don't make sense on their face value, but just trust me that f16 to f11 doubles the amount of light, and f11 to f8 doubles it again. And if you're curious why, you can ask me or your friend Google. The important part here is that we can adjust ISO or aperture or both to compensate for changes we might make to shutter speed and vice versa. That's the exposure triangle, the relationship between ISO, shutter speed, and aperture in creating a proper exposure. Let's come back to our glass of water analogy. The size of the glass is the ISO. How much light do we need? It depends on the ISO setting. Select a higher ISO and we need less light. Shutter speed is how long we turn on the faucet. Aperture is how fast the water flows. We can fill our glass in different ways. We can let the water come out slowly for a long period of time, or turn the faucet up for a shorter period of time, and the end result will be the same. And that's how our camera works. We can get the same amount of light to the sensor in different ways, and we can change the size of the glass by adjusting the ISO. And at this point, I hope you're asking yourself a question. If there are all sorts of ways to get the proper exposure, why does it matter? Why not just turn the camera to its automatic setting, point and shoot and hope? And the answer is because each of those settings affects our photos in ways beyond exposure, in both good ways and in bad. So first, how do we actually set the settings we need to set? This demonstration uses the Canon R7. If you're using a different camera, the location of buttons and knobs will be different, but the concepts are the same for all cameras, and smartphones as well. We have multiple exposure modes available. These are the different settings that allow us more or less control of the camera. They range from the fully automated program mode where the camera sets everything, to modes where the camera will assist us, to fully manual. We control all the settings on the camera. To start, let's work in manual mode, the M setting on the camera. This will allow us to learn how the camera works. At the end of the tutorial, I'll explain some of the other settings and why we might use them. Setting the camera to M means you have manually set the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. This gives you full control of the exposure. On the R7, we change the exposure settings using 3 physical buttons on the camera. Press the ISO button on the top right of the camera, and then use the knurled knob on top or the one on the back of the camera to change the ISO. Higher ISO makes the camera more sensitive to light. So when will we use this? When do we need our camera to be more sensitive to light? When there isn't much light to begin with. At night or indoors, for example. To photograph in darker situations, we turn up the ISO. When there's a lot of light outdoors on a sunny day, we turn down the ISO. Or perhaps we know we'll need to use a fast shutter speed for sports, for example. A fast shutter speed lets in less light, which might require a higher ISO. So why does it matter? Because as we raise the ISO, we lower the image quality. At very high ISOs, we may be able to capture an image, but the quality will not be very good. How high is high? What is too high? It will depend on your camera. For the R7, image quality looks very good up to 1600, looks good at 3200, and starts to suffer above that number. You can see in the examples that at very high ISOs, colors are less rich, and there is what we call digital noise or digital grain. Are the photos still usable? Sure. Do they look as good as images shot at lower ISOs? No. As a general rule, use the lowest ISO you can. Typically, in bright outdoor light, you'll use ISOs in the 100 to 400 range. On an overcast day or in a bright indoor setting, you'll likely shoot in the 400 to 1600 range. And in darker situations, you'll move up to 3200 and beyond. It makes sense to set the ISO first, based on the brightness of the location. It's important to remember that while high ISO image quality isn't as good as lower, we should use those settings when necessary. A picture that is too dark or blurry isn't usable. A sharp, well-exposed photo with some digital noise may be very, very useful. Next, adjust shutter speed and aperture. In manual mode, use the knob on top of the camera to set your shutter speed. The dial on the back sets the aperture. The shutter speed has two functions. First is exposure. The faster the shutter speed, the less light enters the camera. 1/1000th of a second lets in half as much light as 1/500th, for example. So we might choose to lighten or darken a photo by changing the shutter speed. But the shutter speed also affects the sharpness of an image or the subject in the photo. At slow shutter speeds, it is difficult to hold the camera steady, so the whole image will be blurry. There isn't an absolute, but below 1/100th of a second, it becomes increasingly difficult to hold the camera steady. If something in your photo is moving, a car, an athlete, a dog, a little kid, they will be blurry if the shutter speed is too slow. For sports, we try to keep our shutter speed at 1/1000th or faster to freeze the movement. Or we might intentionally use a slow shutter speed to create a sense of motion. The aperture also has two functions. Again, changing the aperture changes the exposure. A small aperture, represented by a larger f number, lets in less light. So f11 lets in less light than f8, for example. But aperture is also a creative tool. You can control to a degree how much of the photo is in focus with the aperture. We'll look at this in greater detail in other tutorials and in class, but the larger the aperture, represented by a smaller f number, the less that will be in focus in front of and behind your subject. This concept is called depth of field. So how do you know what the correct exposure is? In manual mode, the camera displays an exposure scale. Look through the camera's viewfinder, lightly depress the shutter to turn on the camera, and you'll see a display at the bottom of the camera. At the bottom of the screen, we see the shutter speed. We'll also see the aperture as an f number, and we'll see the ISO, the exposure triangle. Between them, we see the exposure meter. The camera is showing us what it thinks the correct exposure should be. By changing any of the exposure triangle parameters, ISO, shutter speed, or aperture, we adjust the exposure. When the scale is only under the 0, the exposure is correct, or at least the camera thinks it's correct. In the field, you can use this metering scale to get to what the camera thinks is the right exposure. This is the final piece of the puzzle. What is the correct exposure? The camera looks at the light entering the camera, but it doesn't interpret that light through your eyes. And the camera has limits, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video. It can't always capture the full range of information in a photo. Look at these images of our friendly gnome. We can adjust the camera so the details of his face are clearly visible, but the background is very overexposed. There's no detail in the sky. Or we can expose so we can see the details in the sky, but our gnome is silhouetted. Which is the correct exposure? Both? Neither? It depends on what you want to capture. In this image, the shape of the gnome is interesting, so a silhouette is effective in creating something visually compelling. But if you frame him in a different way, the silhouette is just a blob, not very interesting at all. On the other hand, seeing his face, his expression, the colors, all of that might be important. So the choice is yours. What are you trying to say with your photo? Not all scenes are so extreme, of course. Usually, we want an exposure that captures the widest range of information possible. One last tool, the histogram. The display can be shown on the camera. Press the info button on the back of the camera to change what is displayed, and we'll see that histogram again in Photoshop. It gives us a picture of exposure. It's a graph plotting the range of brightness. If the curve of the histogram fits within the graph, then we know we have usable information throughout the photo. If the histogram is shifted to one side or the other, our photo is probably over or underexposed. Any part of the curve that is off the scale represents part of your image with no detail at all, either a pure white or pure black. We can, in editing, shift the scale to brighten or darken all or parts of a photo, but if information is completely gone, it can't be recovered. That's the basics of setting the exposure. It's overwhelming at first, lots to remember, but it gets easier with practice. The keys are start in manual mode to learn how the camera works. Adjust the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture to get a proper exposure. Understand the limits of all three and why you might adjust one over the other. Beyond manual mode, the camera offers some degrees of automation. Keep in mind that the camera is simply a machine. The auto modes won't always get it right. The green A mode is the most automated. The camera sets everything and you have no control over the results. Avoid it. The FV mode is a completely automatic mode where you can take some control of the settings. TV is shutter priority. You set the shutter speed and the ISO, and the camera will try to set the appropriate aperture. Where AV is aperture priority. You set the aperture and ISO, and the camera sets the shutter speed. All of these modes have some advantages in some situations, and we can talk more about them in class. But if you want to understand what your camera is actually doing, start with manual. The next step is to go out and practice and play with the camera. Take photos of your friends, your cat, your family. Pay attention to the settings as you go. You'll begin to learn what works and what doesn't.